to then hold a plebiscite, which is one of the things that people have critiqued that movie I showed at the beginning for leaving out. But then President Aylwin and others tried their best to close that space for social mobilization, thinking that it would be more effective to create a space in which, for instance, the enemy of human rights victims potentially becomes a person with whom you would interact in public democratic life. So in terms of creating a space in which Chileans can begin to talk about the memory of violence in Chile, some, including Steve Stern, have argued that it was necessary that the Concertación believed it was necessary to create that kind of closed elite space. Now, throughout the next 2 decades, leading up to this moment in 2011, what we have is kind of an undulation of this sort of opening of what Stern has called synergistic frictions. So movements, or not quite movements, but protests that begin to pressure the government, combined with these moments of closure in which the elite system comes back to kind of reestablish that they're the primary mediators in society. And so in that context, we haven't seen the type of mobilizations like we're seeing now since those moments in the 1980s, potentially because of that closure. And the students react to that context, to that memory, by putting people like Michelle Bachelet, the president who, the now ex-president and candidate for the 2013 election, and president from 2006 to 2010, and Sebastián Piñera and Joaquín Lavín from the ultra-right on the same banner as part of the same political, same political elite, right? So Students Without a Party refers to any of these parties that might be represented by the center-left socialist or the far-right Democratic Union independent politician. So, as one student leader told me, because Chile is a people that suffered very much from the dictatorship. So after the dictatorship, a happiness, a change was promised, a situation of betterment that finally never arrived. So it's evidently clear that in some aspects, or if it's evidently clear that in some aspects things got better, they got much better. However, despite the fact that they got better, they didn't complete what they promised, or they didn't deliver on what they promised. And so this is kind of that moment, or that framing that he's interpreting, that has been, when I interviewed him in 2012, that has been circulating throughout Chile for the last 7 years since 2006, when Bachelet was in power. This critique of a president who was supposed to be from the left, who didn't complete this transition, along with now all the other post-dictatorship presidents who didn't deliver on the social promises or alleviating the social debt, as well as the political transition. And this includes everything from the electoral system to social services like health and, of course, education. So within this context, the students who are charged with communicating about these issues are doing so in a very kind of post-industrial consumer citizen way, right? However, they still maintain, or they still are able to avoid some of the pitfalls that media and social movement scholars like Todd Gitlin and Bernadette are saying happens when social movements try to become too media heavy. So when social movements try to gear all of their activity and their work towards media coverage, there's a tendency for those movements to make drastic decisions to please the media. There's a tendency for those movements to alienate public, and there's a tendency for the movements to end up with a problem of leadership because somebody has to become a spokesperson. Now, I argue that because this is happening within the context of these long-standing institutional frameworks, the student federations, that this movement, which is very much like a new social movement, focused on communication, focused on communicative action as well as social action, so creating mutual understanding about the transition from the dictatorship among people in Chile, among students and families who are saddled with student debt, for instance. As much as they are focused on that, they're also able to maintain a very clear hierarchical structure through the federations and not alienate their bases. As one student told me, it's one of the things that social media does is enables the possibility for student leaders to know what the bases are talking about, right? So there's a feedback mechanism. And what Nancy Fraser kind of characterizes this as is the construction of a counterpublic. And I would call this a strong counterpublic because of the potential for influencing decision-making. First, the decision-making that actually happens at the elite level, and then because of the potential to influence decision-making at the national government level as well. So this is a shot of one of the student leaders explaining to me how they conceive of their audiences and how they conceive of their kind of workflow. So this is about the process, the steps that they collect information and then eventually get to publication of something, right? In which he's explaining this. This is how they conceive of, and it's somewhat sophisticated in the sense that they definitely think about the way that they're messaging to different publics. So it's hard to see. This says public opinion. This says the government. This says students at the Universidad de Chile, right? And then this is them, the communication team that exists as part of the presidency of the Student Federation at the University of Chile, Universidad de Chile. So this communication team sees themselves as tasked with mediating the very particular concerns of the Universidad de Chile students who are concerned with democratization within the university, who are concerned with specific issues in different faculties, different departments which each have representation. And the task that they find themselves in communicating to a broader public opinion. One of the things that they've notably, both at the Universidad de Chile as well as the Universidad Católica, have been able to do is extend this discourse that began in 2006, or that began around the middle of the 2000s, in which kind of these battles over memory had settled to some extent, and there was a sense of shared tragedy among people in Chile. There was a movement to begin critiquing the neoliberal system, right? So the system of market reforms and a free market policy that cut social services during the dictatorship and also changed the consistency of social life so that citizens became consumers within the political sphere. They had managed to extend this critique that arose out of that time to include, or to a larger segment of the population by, as one student who was part of the Universidad de Chile mentioned, by positioning themselves as the primary actors in a broken system. So they've taken on education because they're the primary actors, and they've taken on education despite the fact that many of them might have critiques about, as this student put it, making shoes and how that is problematic in a capitalist or neoliberal economy. They've rooted their complaints within this social issue to be able to get to a broader public outside of just students and talk about the burden on families, for instance, and on students. And then they also conceived of the government as yet another audience that they're trying to communicate with. And I was fortunate to be in their office for a couple of instances in which they were generating quotes for the for generally radio and online news, as well as CNN in Chile, who had contacted them to respond to this guy, who those of you who are really familiar with this case will probably laugh. This is supposed to be the education minister, Harold Bayer, who is a technocrat. And what they're trying to do here is paint him as a data-munching kind of robot who can only see education and can only see, and of course the Tin Man with no heart, for those of you who know The Wizard of Oz, who can only see this sort of world of social services through the lens of public policy based in economic data, right? So that's their larger critique that tends to come out in the media, of Bayer in particular. And it's interesting because some students will then extend, of course, as I say, that critique beyond Bayer, who's the Minister of Education, to many other sectors of economic life. So I'm running out of time, like I said I wouldn't. So I'm going to, I think, just raise a couple last questions about what this means potentially for memory and what this means for 2013. So this quote was just posted actually a couple days ago. This is the president of the FEUC. He's saying, "We're a generation that lost the fear. Let's reclaim what is ours." So this is the kind of the call going into 2013 as mobilizations begin now. And so I want to just end by saying that in assessing the kind of goals of the social movement, or assessing the kind of successes of this social movement, though they're clearly stated on banners and by spokespeople under the banner of free public education or universal quality education, what we understand from that, what we can understand from that, and what people within online social networks often get are very different meanings, right? So universal public education can mean, of course, state-run and state-owned education to some, and it can mean scholarships and student-backed or government-backed student loans for others. So, what then, besides this sort of key slogan, is the movement gaining? And I'll leave that question and can answer more of it in the question and answer. But I think what I'll point out are these three kind of final points, that this movement has called attention through its publicity of profit making in many of the educational institutions and the private universities, starting notably with Universidad Central in Santiago and extending now to a case in Viña del Mar, which is kind of the latest exemplar of nefarious profit making in the education system. They've called attention to political and economic elite partnerships that others knew existed, but were not at the tip of people's tongues. It's also given Chilean students, and I would argue other people in Chile, a broader language and a rationale to critique the political and economic legacy of the Pinochet dictatorship, this idea that social institutions shouldn't be consumer goods appeared in a critique one of the last nights I was there on Channel 13 in Santiago, in which, to the surprise of many activists whom I asked later, they mentioned the critique that two of the student leaders made about the neoliberal system in Chile. So this is something that is commonly heard on mass outlets like Channel 13 in television station in Chile. And third, the movement has revealed the potential to construct these potential counterpublics and raise issues of public concern through newly expanded communication networks. So that sort of communication, just like we saw the democratic practices that emerged during the takeovers of student buildings and schools, we also see that the sort of democratic communication networks that have formed online in places like Facebook and Twitter have been ritualized just like this sort of behavior, so that students make talking about politics part of their daily life and have even begun recontextualizing that transition period as more of these sorts of memory knots and dates come up. And that these communication through the formal channels has been extremely successful in reaching millions of people and gathering around 70% support for the goals of the movement. The informal networks have made collaboration, mobilization, and information sharing accessible to a generation whose sense of common cause seemed to be eroded at some point around the time that shopping malls came into Chile. So I think this is the kind of reconstruction, potentially, of political and social life that's happening in Chile. And I'll take about 5 minutes of questions, so sorry to go over. Yeah, Ryan?
Yeah, thanks for doing this. It's good to see a fellow J schooler talk about these things. I do have a J schooly kind of question for you. And you kind of hinted at it toward the end. You were talking about Channel 13 and everything. Mm-hmm. I know in big countries, when there are student movements like this, usually there's a lot of resentment toward mainstream media. So like Televisa, Globo, even the Wall Street Journal. Did you get the sense that this sort of transition to using social media as a major force for communication was in part driven by resentment toward media outlets like that? Like they don't think that they're able to get their message across because they have a huge problem with the news media?
So that's part of the argument I'm making actually in another paper that I'm working on, is about what another person over in the J School, Doug McLeod, has called media disassociation. This idea that activists tend to experience political life and protest in particular in real life, and then begin to kind of set themselves apart from and become more cynical about the media, specifically because they have this kind of ability to contrast real protest life with what they see in the media. And it forms this sort of cynicism about what the media is able to cover. Now in Chile, there's good reason, because of the elite control of many of the media institutions and the market-based both newspaper and television system there, to be cynical about it. But what I found is that also extended to journalists, which is interesting, because many of the journalists, not all of them, are there in the trenches in some ways at protests. There's a whole core of citizen journalists that have developed, photographers, as well as people who are writing posts and filming YouTube videos. And so it's very popular now that those sorts of things will get circulated. Generally, and I don't think I included it in here, but generally most mainstream news information that I see on Facebook is framed by student leaders within some context, and generally it's negative. So there was a recent editorial in La Tercera newspaper in Chile, and the 8 kind of posts that I saw were all saying, oh, these guys, look at them making a horrible excuse for you know, abuse and profit making. You know, they're just trying to rationalize you know, what's really horrible about the education system. So people are sharing traditional news in that way, I think partly because of that reaction you're talking about. So it's very strong. Yeah. Now the guys that I showed you who were talking about the mainstream media, they have potentially a more sophisticated view of which different outlets might be more receptive to their sorts of messages. So they have good relationships with a couple of online newspapers, and they have good relationships with a couple of radio stations. And an event that I attended in Valparaiso was attended primarily by those who, you notice the journalists who are there longest tend to be the kind of alternative journalists with alternative perspectives. The ones that stay shorter periods of time tend to be the ones who are for more center or maybe center-right media. Yeah?
The Chileans restarted a new electoral cycle a few days ago. And like us here in the United States, they have a volunteer vote. A system is volunteer. And we know the core of the successful electoral campaigns is in the ability to mobilize blocks of electors to the day of the election. And in your research, you developed about what was the impact, or more important for the journalists, would be the impact in the real electors' blocks of this movement. What is the impact? Because probably, yeah, it's a main issue in the social media. But what is the real impact in an electoral cycle?
Right. So that, I mean, that's kind of the debate that's happening now. And when I interviewed Giorgio Jackson, this was just before he launched the kind of new political party that he's running for member of Congress under the Revolución Democrática. So he wasn't quite articulating what it might mean to have a student voting bloc, if that's the question that I think you're asking. I think the other side of that is the ability to organize a potential no vote, right? So what we saw in October in the municipal elections was a campaign on Twitter that was at least effective on Twitter, and it's hard to match these things up, but it was at least effective on Twitter in that the I Don't Give My Vote campaign was flowing through activist circles and was reported in the traditional mainstream media. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting there was the characterization of the vote, of the no vote, or the people who did not vote as an abstention or as potentially a protest vote. So different people were characterizing it in different ways. And so, and there was a high non-voter turnout, right? So just like in this country, it's hard to tell whether that's actually because of a concerted political campaign, but my daily sense is that there are students, especially younger students, who either haven't voted before or skipped the October election cycle, who are very committed to not voting because they've really internalized a lot of the framing of the concertación and the post-dictatorship kind of context. So that could be a potential problematic effect. But the university students seem to be taking the lead, at least some of them, in organizing these political blocs. And one of the students just told me last week that they were fairly certain that they would get universal education out of one of the candidates, and he was talking specifically about Michelle Bachelet. He then went on to say, but the form in which it comes is what will be problematic. And that's the thing to watch out for. Yeah. Erica?
I'm interested in the politics of memory insofar as using and sort of embracing this idea that you can make a comparison to it being like in a dictatorship again, whether or not there are potential downsides to doing that and how that's perceived more broadly. I mean, it's clearly a language that seems to resonate within the student community, but I'm curious if you had any exposure to how that's perceived among people who are a little bit older and perhaps who were alive and have political memories of those earlier moments. There's a tension there.
So I think that's a good question about the generational tension. I've seen it not particularly about questions of the dictatorship, but I did witness a kind of 50 or 60-year-old man walk by a group of protesters and say, this country's going to hell, right? So kind of maybe reminiscent of this sort of this climate that was emerging in the early 70s before the dictatorship. This sort of tension between vibrant social movements and those people who do feel alienated by their message. That alienation, I think, continued as violence mounted in 2011, and this is a problem that the student leaders had to attend to in the mainstream media talking about this. As far as treating the dictatorship, or treating the current moment as bad as the dictatorship, calling this the dictatorship, it's coming from certainly the most radical camps, but it taps into this idea that that Pinochet's sort of socio-political power was lost in the 1990s.